Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. Today is the first session of our discussion of the peoples of Middle-earth. We have finally come to the 12th volume of the history of Middle-earth. We have discussed our way chapter by chapter through the entire thing, from the Book of Lost Tales, Volume 1, all the way through the peoples of Middle-earth here in our final installment. We started our discussion of the Book of Lost Tales here on the Mythgard Academy in March of 2014. Some little bit more than 11 years ago. And it'll probably be 12 before we finish, which means we'll have averaged a volume a year, which is pretty good, right? It was May? Okay, it was May. Still, that was just a little while ago. In which case, again, yes, we'll still, I don't know exactly how long it's going to take us to do the peoples of Middle-earth. Maybe we'll finish before next May. I think it possible that we will finish prior to next May, but who knows? We'll see. I'm not fixing to rush through the peoples of Middle-earth because there's some really interesting stuff in here. But in any case, we're going to be averaging about one a year, combined with other books that have been interspersed along the way. Many wonderful and interesting books interspersed along the way. We just finished Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. After the Peoples of Middle-earth, we're going to be doing Phantastes by George MacDonald. And then who knows what comes after that? We'll have to do another election. But anyway, that's going to be good fun. But first, the peoples of Middle-earth. Before we get locked into the peoples of Middle-earth, however, and start with the foreword, which is not the chapter 1, which is called Prologue and talks about the prologue, except when it's called the foreword, not to be confused with the other foreword. Before we get into any of that, we are going to, I just wanted to make sure that everybody heard about our newest program because it's really exciting and I wanted to share it with you. The newest thing that Signum is doing to provide learning opportunities for everyone that we can who is interested even vaguely in our subject matters is called Signum Tutorials. What this is it's an opportunity for completely student-driven learning. If there is a program of study that you would like to pursue, or if there's a project that you are working on that you really need help with, right? If you're writing a master's thesis, that's a really long and involved research project. And throughout that research project, you will be assigned a thesis director who will be mentoring you and advising you and providing you feedback all the way through that process. In our master's degree program, it's a year-long process, lots and lots of close work with that faculty mentor who helps you along with your project. That's an awesome experience. And at the end of it, I just came from Mythmoot this past weekend where we had our graduation for our most recent graduates. It is always so cool to hear from our graduates and from our faculty talking about our graduates and the experiences that they have had not only in their classes, but in the work that they've been doing on their theses and stuff. But here's the thing. What if you're doing a project like that, but outside of the context of a degree program? Like if, many people pursue our master's degree program, and it's a great master's degree program. But what if the rigid definitions of a master's degree program don't fit what you want to do, or if your time frame doesn't fit with the time frame of what you could comfortably do in the graduate program, or if what you're wanting to do is just kind of beyond the scope of it. For instance, say you already have, maybe you've even gotten your master's degree with us and you want to pursue your research further. You want to carry on your project and expand it into a PhD level book project. Maybe you are an amateur, but you've got an idea for an article that you think could work. Like there's a thing you want to write about Tolkien, maybe, or about one of the other books maybe that we've discussed or something else. But, you're not a literary person. Like you've not been trained, you were not an English major, whatever, or it's been a long time. And, you would really quite prefer to undertake this project with a mentor, right, who could provide you feedback and advice and guidance along the way. Or maybe you're a creative writer and you would like somebody you've been working on a novel, but you really would like somebody who will be working with you along the way and who can be giving you steady accountability and feedback as you're writing your novel all the way to the end of the process. Maybe you have, you're a student who's written some stuff and you're thinking like, well, gosh, maybe I should get some of this stuff published. Some of my professors encouraged me to do that, but that's kind of outside the scope of what you do with your professors in class, right? Wouldn't it be nice if you could get one of your professors to be your mentor, right? And help you expand and polish your paper and get it into a form where it's going to be something that's going to be attractive to publishers. Maybe you are thinking about presenting a moot paper. Maybe you've been to one of our regional moots or to Myth Moot and you've said, I've got an idea of a presentation I could give, but I feel like I'm in way over my head. I don't know how to really approach that. I've never done that before. Wouldn't it be great to have a mentor, right, who could work with you on all of these things? Anyway, that is the kind of stuff that the Signum Tutorials program is designed to enable. It basically enables students to approach Signum University individually with stuff that you want to learn, with projects that you would like help and guidance in order to pursue a mentor. And we will pair you up with a mentor and we will provide you the resources that you need in order to pursue your project and bring it to completion. Anyway, that is what the Signum Tutorials program is all about. It can also, it's a very flexible program and can even be used for really simple things. Like, for instance, you've written a paper and you would like to get some tutoring on that. Like just some really simple, like I'm writing a paper and I would love to have somebody work with me on helping me to write a better essay, right? Just basic writing tutoring. You could get that too. You could get subject tutoring, right? Maybe you are, trying to learn Old English, but you're baffled by Beowulf, and it would really help if there were somebody, maybe you purchased and downloaded our wonderful set of lectures by Mike Drought on learning Old English, right? But, you would like a little help, as you're going along and trying to learn it. There's some stuff that's still confusing you and you're kind of getting, losing the thread, right, in the middle of the lecture series. You could get, we could arrange for you to have a tutor, right, to help you through with that stuff. So, anyway, that is what we are offering at Signum Tutorials. Everything from help with writing your essay all the way up through mentorship to write your novel or develop your PhD project. Now, keep in mind, no degrees are attached to this. This is just continuing education in its purest form. All higher education is continuing education, but most higher education only offers a little bit of continuing education, focused into the very narrow degree programs that they offer. We want to do more and to make broader resources available to people everywhere who are interested in studying at any level. So, anyway, that is what we are offering now. So what you do, go to blackberry.signumuniversity.org, and you will see on the left-hand side of the BlackBerry menu here, this new Signum Tutorials area. You click here, and you will find the Signum Tutorials homepage here in BlackBerry, and all you have to do is click here on the student interest form. When you do, it brings you to this simple one-page form where you just tell us who you are, what language you want to study in, and just tell us about your project, and we'll get in touch with you. It is really simple. There is no, commitment at the beginning. Oh, and I didn't mention the tuition. The tuition is just space tokens. So the same tokens that you purchase to do our classes in space that we've been offering for 3 years now, you use to get a month of tutoring, within the context of our Signum tutoring program. So there you go. That is how our Signum Tutorials program works, and I encourage you, check it out. If you are interested or even just kind of curious, like, this is kind of a thing that I'm thinking about. I'm writing this novel and I'd like to kind of learn, I'd like to immerse myself in some of this like history or language to support the world building that I want to do in my book. Or maybe, again, you want a mentor to guide you through the process of writing your book itself. Or, maybe, again, you have a scholarly project that you have in mind, or something you've always wanted to give a presentation on or to write a paper on. Or maybe you've done a presentation and you are thinking, maybe I should, that went really well. Maybe I should try to develop this presentation into a paper that I could publish. All of those steps we can do. But there we go. That's what the Signum Tutorials program is. If you're wondering, you can just fill out the student interest form or send an email to tutorials@signumu.org, and they can help you out and advise you. All right. Let's jump into the text. Let us begin with Christopher Tolkien's foreword to The Peoples of Middle-earth. I found this foreword especially interesting, because he's stepping back and talking about the project as a whole. He begins by mentioning that when he did the history of Middle-earth, you may recall when we discussed that several years ago, that Christopher said, I'm not going to talk about the appendices at this time. And, he begins his foreword by confessing when he said at this time, he kind of didn't plan to do it at all and was being vague, right? But then decided, no, I really should do that. So he says, thus I embarked on the study of the history of these works, of which I had little precise knowledge. As with the narrative texts of The Lord of the Rings, those of the appendices and of the prologue became divided, in some cases, in a bewildering fashion, at the time of the sale of the papers to Marquette University. But I received most generous help, prompt and meticulous, from Charles Elston, the archivist of the Memorial Library at Marquette, which enabled me to determine the textual relations. It was only now that I came to understand that texts of supplementary essays to The Lord of the Rings had reached a remarkably finished form, though in many respects far different from the published appendices, at a much earlier date than I had supposed. In the period, as I judge, immediately following my father's writing of the last chapter of The Lord of the Rings in 1948. There is indeed a total absence in these texts of indications of external date, but it can be seen from many points that when they were written, the narrative was not yet in final form, and equally clearly that they in fact preceded my father's return to the First Age at the beginning of the 1950s, as described in the foreword to The War of the Jewels. A major upheaval in the historical linguistic structure was still to come, the abandonment of their own tongue by the Noldor returning out of the West, and their adoption of the Sindarin of Middle-earth. Okay, so let's kind of back up and make sure we're understanding what he's talking about here. So he was the first thing that he is... So first of all, let's remember what we've done already, right? Let's remember the recent history of Middle-earth that we have discussed. So you will recall that the history of Middle-earth is roughly in chronological order. And the first 5 volumes, am I right about that? Yes, I am right about that. I'm looking up my bookshelf to make sure I'm remembering correctly. The first 5 volumes of the history of Middle-earth are in the period of time that predates the writing of The Lord of the Rings, basically, though it includes the writing of The Hobbit. So from the Book of Lost Tales, Volume 1 and 2, through the Lays of Beleriand, and then the Shaping of Middle-earth, that's what it's called, Shaping of Middle-earth, and The Lost Road. Those are all the story. Most of them have to do with the development, the early emergence, and then development of the Silmarillion material, all the way up through and including the 1937 Quenta Silmarillion, which is really important. You can find that in The Lost Road, along with the abortive novel called The Lost Road. But you can find the 1937 Quenta, and that's particularly exciting because you may remember that when The Hobbit came out, right, when The Hobbit was published in 1937 and was selling like gangbusters, and Allen and Unwin was like, Professor Tolkien, we would love another book. You'll remember that although they were thinking of another Hobbit serial adventure, he was thinking of the Silmarillion. Right. He was like, my ship has come in, and he starts frantically preparing, revising and preparing the Silmarillion for publication in 1937. And The Lost Road, Volume 5, is where we can see that which was basically Tolkien's, like the end of that first long chapter. If we divide Tolkien's sort of literary life into 3 stages, right? The pre-Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Rings, and post-Lord of the Rings. The end of the pre-Lord of the Rings development of the Silmarillion stuff came there in 1937 when he had this wild surmise, right, that he was going to get things published, right, the Silmarillion published. Then, of course, the publisher kindly but firmly said that no, massive, enormous, possibly multi-volume Silmarillion is not actually what we had in mind, right? What we have in mind is a sequel to The Hobbit, the further adventures of Bilbo Baggins, perhaps, right? At which point Tolkien said, well, fine. And he sat down to write the further adventure of Bilbo Baggins, which he began in an almost... it would be too harsh to say that he began it in a spiteful spirit, but it seems a little pointed that the first thing he did was sit down and write a long-expected party of when Bilbo leaves forever, never to return. So it seemed to kind of, in some sense, reflect the mixed feelings that he had about being asked to write a sequel, and in particular to be writing like the continuing adventures of Bilbo Baggins. Now, you're right, Kal-El Russ. In the end, what happened was he said, fine, I'll write the most successful book of the 20th century. But it didn't look like that to him or anybody else for a long time, right? So during that time, we have basically the more or less decade in which the appendices the Lord of the Rings was being written, right? The story of the Lord of the Rings was being written. And it was finished up in the late 40s, 1947, 1948, around there is when he finally finished the whole story. But of course, you'll remember it does not get published until 1954, is when the first volume, when the Fellowship of the Ring comes out, finally. And that long delay was largely his own fault, I was just telling this story in my Lotro stream last week, in which he went back to Allen and Unwin and said, you still want to publish this thing? And they're like, okay, yeah, we'll publish it. But then he started having that flirtation with Milton Waldman from HarperCollins. And Milton Waldman seemed interested, possibly. Or at least Tolkien convinced himself that Milton Waldman was interested in publishing the Silmarillion along with The Lord of the Rings. And that's what Tolkien really wanted. So Tolkien... This, of course, the origin of the famous letter to Milton Waldman, right, in which Tolkien does his big synopsis of the Silmarillion. That was a sales pitch, right? He is trying to convince Milton Waldman to publish the Silmarillion and to publish it alongside The Lord of the Rings. And he thought that but he also kind of had an existing agreement with Allen and Unwin. So rather than just ditch Allen and Unwin, which he would have felt guilty about, he manipulated the situation. Tolkien believed at this time, that Milton Waldman of HarperCollins was going to agree to publish The Lord of the Rings with the Silmarillion. And that's what he wanted. And Allen and Unwin had said, no, we're not doing the Silmarillion alone. So basically he was like, I would feel like I was breaking the agreement if I just pulled it back from Allen and Unwin and gave it to HarperCollins instead. But if I make them say no, then my conscience will be clear. So he basically goes back to Allen and Unwin with like an ultimatum. He's like, it's all or nothing, people. right? Either the Silmarillion with the Lord of the Rings or nothing. And Rayner Unwin, who'd been working with him for years, was like, can we maybe talk about, like, I love your work, man, would love to publish the Lord of the Rings, but I really don't. And then he's like, and then he pushed him, like, yes or no, ultimatum, yes or no, yes to all or no to all. And Rayner's like, well, then no, I have to say no, because we can't possibly publish that enormous thing called the Silmarillion. And so he said no. And Tolkien's like, great, thank you. And he goes to Milton Waldman. But guess what? Milton Waldman actually was less interested in publishing the Silmarillion than Tolkien had thought. So after some further discussions, that fell apart. And now Tolkien had no publisher for the Lord of the Rings at all. And there was some time in which he thought he wasn't going to get the Lord of the Rings published. But finally, he kind of crawled back to Allen and Unwin, and he's like, so you still interested in publishing the Lord of the Rings even without the Silmarillion? Changed my mind. And they finally agreed, and that's how the Lord of the Rings got published eventually without the Silmarillion. So that is like the shenanigans that were going on between like 1947, 48 and 1954. During that time, though, of course, Tolkien was not idle. And as we recall, so the central set, books, again, I'm looking at my bookshelf, book 6, 7, 8, and part of 9, Sauron Defeated. So the central 4 volumes are about the development of the Lord of the Rings, right? About the process of drafting the Lord of the Rings. And yes, it's true, First Fish, that he still had the manuscripts of the Lord of the Rings and could still fidget with them. They weren't set yet at that point. But the whole thing was like mostly written. So some of volume 9, volume 9 still includes the stuff that he was working on. So there's a bunch of non-Lord of the Rings stuff in volume 9, including most notably the Notion Club papers and some other Númenórean stuff. But that stuff isn't stuff that he wrote after he finished writing the Lord of the Rings. That was the stuff that he interrupted writing the Lord of the Rings in order to write. So Sauron Defeated, from the Return of the Shadow through Sauron Defeated, those central 4 volumes, volumes 6 through 9 of the history of Middle-earth, cover like what he was working on during the Lord of the Rings time, right? Then in volume 10, which is Morgoth's Ring, and then volume 11, The War of the Jewels, which are the 2 that we just most recently discussed, that lays out what happens when he turned back to the Silmarillion. And Christopher dates the early parts of his enthusiastic return to the Lord of the Rings, to the Silmarillion, inspired by the Lord of the Rings stuff that he'd just written, which, of course, he decided to place within the Silmarillion world, right? Within the Silmarillion was now more than just those stories that I used to write years ago. The Silmarillion was now the ancient history of the world that the Lord of the Rings takes place in, right? And so he enthusiastically returns to the Silmarillion material, and he spends the next decade or so, from 10 to 15 years, from 1950-ish through like 1964, 65 or so, in reworking the Silmarillion stuff. And that's the material in Morgoth's Ring and War of the Jewels. So now, here at the beginning of the Peoples of Middle-earth, Christopher Tolkien is looking back and saying, okay, so he's saying that he had kind of suspected that Tolkien had like jumped straight into, in the beginning of the 50s, returning to the First Age and going back to the Silmarillion stuff. And what he's saying here is that it's now pretty clear that a bunch of the stuff from the appendices was all being written earlier than he thought it was. Let me contextualize that a little bit. Back to the publication of The Lord of the Rings. 1954, the Fellowship of the Ring is published. 1955, The Two Towers is published. 1956, The Return of the King is published. There's a delay. There was a relatively short turnaround between between the Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers, but there was a longer delay The Return of the King was 1955. There was a longer duration. It was more than a year between The Two Towers and The Return of the King. And the reason for that was the appendices. There may still be some, I know there are still some in our community who remember reading The Two Towers when it first came out and ending with, remember it ends with Sam knocking himself unconscious against the gate to the undergate to the Tower of Cirith Ungol, ending with the sentence, Frodo was alive but taken by the enemy. And then the reading public, who had read the first 2 volumes, had to wait for more than a year until The Return of the King came out. And the reason for the delay, which had Rayner Unwin like pulling out his few remaining locks of hair, was the appendices. Tolkien wanted to include the appendices, and he was going back and forth and adding stuff and doing all this stuff and cramming things into the appendices. So when Christopher Tolkien here says, it was only now that I came to understand that texts of supplementary essays to The Lord of the Rings had reached a remarkably finished form, though in many respects far different from the published appendices, at a much earlier date than I had supposed. The date which he presumably had supposed prior to this was 1954 to 55, right? Because it was known that the final assembly and polishing of the appendices was the cause of the delay of the publication of The Return of the King. And Fencing Frog, it's so true. When you compare Tolkien's delay to like George R. R. Martin or Patrick Rothfuss or something like that, I mean, it's like nothing, right? But still, it was kind of a big deal. Anyway, so it seems to me that what Christopher is suggesting here, that before he assembled the texts, the manuscript evidence of the early drafts of the appendices material, he had thought that the appendices were not really brought to completion until the mid-50s, hence the delay to The Return of the King. Now, Jackie says, this is interesting because Tolkien sent Christopher a letter mentioning the appendices in 1944. Yes, Christopher knew certainly that appendices material existed. Notice what he emphasizes here is that it had reached a remarkably finished form at a much earlier date than I had supposed. So he knew that his dad was intending to do appendices and that he was collecting material for appendices. What he didn't realize was, oh my gosh, those things were almost done. Like they're in an advanced state way earlier than he thought. He knew there was stuff. Like he knew there was a drawer, right, into which his father was turfing, the clips that he was taking out, and is like, I gotta take this out, right? But I'm gonna keep it, and I'm gonna, I'll fit it into the appendices, right? So he knew that this is, Jackie is thinking of the famous reference to Faramir and stuff like that. Yeah, I will just read it, Jackie, since you've quoted it. Thanks. The letter in the letter, he says, Faramir, the brother of Boromir, and he is holding up the catastrophe by a lot of stuff about the history of Gondor and Rohan, with some very sound reflections, no doubt, on martial glory and true glory. But if he goes on much more, a lot of him will have to be removed to the appendices, where already some fascinating material on the Hobbit tobacco industry and the languages of the West have gone. Right, exactly. Yeah, that's letter 66. The famous letter in which he says, like, if Faramir doesn't shut up, he's gonna get moved wholesale to the appendices, right? So yes, that shows that at that point in 44, he was already envisioning. He already had the drawer, right? He had this drawer in which he was taking stuff that he had cut out of the narrative because he's like, well, that's interesting, but it kind of, it disrupts the the flow of the story too much, right? So, but he didn't throw it away. Tolkien never throws anything away, right? So he took them and he put them, and by the way, the drawer is a metaphor. I'm not saying I know that he literally had them in a drawer. I'm just saying, metaphorically, he shoved them in the appendices drawer, right? But so again, clearly Christopher Tolkien thought that the appendices drawer was like, the literary junk drawer of, still by like 1950 or something. And that the majority of the work that was done, it's a spiritual drawer, Cal Ross. Exactly so. Exactly so. And that basically the work of like the difficult work of doing the appendices in 1954, and 55, was basically him taking the junk drawer and turning it into the published appendices. And so what Christopher says here is that when he looked into the manuscripts, he was surprised to discover that in fact, what Tolkien had written was not, it was what he had in the 40s was not just a collection of scraps that still had to get stitched together somehow. What he had was the text of supplementary essays, though in many respects far different from the published appendices, but in a remarkably finished form and at an earlier date than he had supposed. So by 1948, he had a lot of the appendices worked out to a far greater degree than Christopher had thought that he had. Which means, by the way, so what did hold up the Return of the King? Answer, niggling, right? Tolkien's final agonizing decisions about what to include or what not to include, and final tweaks and edits. And, I'm surprised, I bet you Rainer Unwin experienced some temptations to like drive to his house and just like, yank the manuscript out of Tolkien's hands. It basically wouldn't surprise me at all if Rainer had experienced that. Yeah. Jocelyn, Christopher says that Tolkien, the sale to Marquette is, surprising. Jocelyn was saying it's surprising to me that he sold all these things to Marquette without actually looking them over first, so he was surprised by what was there. Yeah. Jocelyn, there's no, I'll go several steps further. There's little about the sale to Marquette that does not surprise me. I find the whole thing kind of shocking from beginning to end. He didn't need the money. So it's not like he was desperate. He might have sold, if he could get a buyer for his papers, if he could have sold like, his manuscripts of the Book of Lost Tales, Lock, Stock and Barrel, back in, like the 20s or, like when his kids were little or something. Oh man, he'd have done it. Right. But by the time he sold the manuscripts to Marquette, he didn't need the money. So it was not some kind of act of personal desperation or something. And yeah, Jocelyn, he sent over stuff he didn't even know was in there. They were still discovering stuff in there. And there was this, Christopher gives the impression of a lot of correspondence between himself and the Marquette people, where sometimes the Marquette people would be like, oh yeah, we found this in the papers. Maybe it doesn't belong here. You should have it back. And Christopher, in turn, finding drafts of The Hobbit that were turning up in random odd places. And he'd send them to Marquette. He's like, these should have been included in the sale. So anyway, yeah, Jocelyn, the thing was a mess, a complete mess, which we'll come back to in just a few minutes. But anyway, yeah. So Tolkien did it. I still don't really understand why Tolkien did it. I've never really understood that. But anyway, why Marquette University in Wisconsin, you asked? Because they asked. Like they proposed it. And he was like, okay. Anyway, okay. Well, maybe he did want to make sure they were preserved in some archive brick tales, but like, I don't know. Maybe his own college might have, like, surely he could have gone to his own Oxford college to propose this, right? Especially by that time in his career when he was quite famous. Anyway, I don't know. As I say, I have never understood the sale of the Marquette manuscripts. But anyway, okay. Let me not just go on about my puzzlement there, because that is what it is. Okay, so Christopher here establishes the fact that although some of the materials that ended up getting included, like some of the scraps in the drawer that ended up getting included in the appendices, some of those date from way back to the very beginning drafts. And we'll see some more of this evidence as we move through the prologue material, for instance. But Christopher here says that he says, but it can be seen from many points that when they were written, the narrative was not yet in final form. The narrative of the Lord of the Rings was not yet in final form. That's a very interesting point. That he was already forming the appendices into their final form. Not only did he not just do that like way later during the publication process, like in 1954, but even before he had finally completed the text of the Lord of the Rings, he was already forming the appendices material, because you can see places, and we'll look at some of them, where the material he was working on in the appendices shows that it came before the final version of the text of the Lord of the Rings, especially the end of the Lord of the Rings. So yes, it can be seen from many points that they were written when the narrative was not yet in final form, and equally clearly that they in fact preceded my father's return to the first stage at the beginning of the 1950s. So he's like, there can be no doubt that before he went back and he's like, hey, let me like flesh out the children of Húrin, and hey, let me begin that amazing story of the fall of Gondolin that I'm never going to finish, much to everyone's grief and sorrow. Before he did those things, before he was like, let me write 3 more versions of the Annals of Valinor, right? Instead, he did the appendices first. So even before that time, he was doing it. Okay. More, Christopher. In my account, Christopher says, I have of course concentrated on these early forms, which belong so evidently in manner and air with the narrative itself. I have little doubt that my father had long contemplated such a supplement and accompaniment to The Lord of the Rings, regarding it as an essential element in the whole, and I have found it impossible to show in any satisfactory way how he conceived it at that time, without setting out the early texts in full, although this naturally entails the recital, especially in the case of the history of Arnor and Gondor, of much that is known from its survival in the published versions of the appendices. I have excluded the Appendix E, writing and spelling, but I have included the prologue, and I have introduced into this part of the book an account of the origin and development of the Akallabeth, since the evolution of the chronological structure of the Second Age was closely related to my father's original formalized computation of the dates of the Númenórean kings. Okay, so the appendices were part of the formation process of the Lord of the Rings. And here he emphasizes at the beginning of this paragraph that I've quoted here 2 important things. Number 1, there were always going to be appendices. That there needed to be appendices to the Lord of the Rings, and that the appendices of the Lord of the Rings are going to be an essential element of the story, was clear to Tolkien from the beginning. That long before Tolkien came anywhere close to finishing writing The Lord of the Rings, he was already thinking of the appendices. And Jackie, that's what letter 66 shows, right? that is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that we can see that in 1944, which is well along the process, right? He begins the process in late 1937, the beginning of 1938 of writing The Lord of the Rings. That's when he finally gives over, and Alan and Einman convince him that no, we really don't want the Silmarillion as the sequel to The Hobbit. Anyway, so he was it letter 100? Sorry, Jackie, I wasn't sure what that note was. That was 66. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, okay, great. So that letter does show clear evidence that he was already, in his letters to Christopher, when he's still in the middle of writing The Return of the King, he's already casually alluding to the appendices plural, right? He had this as a concept for sure. That is something that he wanted to do. And here we have again Christopher's Christopher assuring us that Tolkien regarded it as essential. The second thing that is, I think, really important about the beginning of this paragraph is Christopher's emphasis that the earliest versions of the appendices belong so evidently in manner and air with the narrative itself. That is to say, they emerged organically as part of Tolkien's storytelling, by and large. The earliest forms of the appendices were not Tolkien sitting back and doing some kind of analysis of his text or some kind of factual supplement. It might be, if we just read the appendices, right? If we just read The Lord of the Rings, if we knew nothing at all, and we just read The Lord of the Rings and the appendices, and somebody asked, so you get like 100 people who are in that situation, who know nothing about the literary history at all, they've just read The Lord of the Rings and they read the appendices, and you ask them, what do you think happened there? How did Tolkien come to write those? How do those relate to the rest of the text? I would not be surprised to find a large number of those 100 people saying something like, well, it sounds like he wrote the story and then he decided to go back and fill in the gaps, right? He decided after he wrote the story that he needed to go back and explain some things and revisit some things and give some background. And so he decided to flesh out the history and flesh out the world building a little bit, kind of retroactively, to sort of show the deeper history of the entire world. I have vague memories of that being my own impression when I first was reading the appendices. When I was a teenager. So, by the way, I didn't read the appendices for a long time. When I got to Well, I'm Back, I tended to go back to The Long Expected Party again, instead of reading the appendices. So I didn't even read the prologue. I skipped the prologue and the appendices for a long time. Like, I didn't even discover that Tolkien had written those. And I think the primary reason was that I always, as a kid, I had a deep distrust of introductions to books. Usually they're written by other people, and almost always they were like super boring. And even when they weren't super boring, they also contained like spoilers and stuff. And I remember the first time I read an introduction and it gave a spoiler to the book, and I was so mad that like I never read an introduction ever again. So it was funny. I was delighted to find many, many, many years later, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis both agreeing on the point that you should never read the introduction of a book before you've read the book. But anyway, so I took this very understandable, natural, and I think wholly defensible objection to an indefensible extreme when I was a teenager. And I tended just not even to look at any supplementary materials. Like I just had the habit of like, I'd open the book and I'd be like, blah, 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 chapter 1. And I'd start at chapter 1. And then I'd come to the end of the story and there'd still be some stuff in the back. And I'd be like, yeah, okay, I'm good. Right. Is story actually done? Yeah, story's actually done. Okay. So seriously, like I had read the Lord of the Rings text many times before I even discovered that the appendices and the prologue were in fact written by Tolkien himself, right? So I did eventually read them, but I didn't read them for a long time. But there is a lot in the back of the Return of the King, Green Great Dragon. It's true. It's true. Anyway. But as I say, it would be my own vague memories are having that sense of like that this was additional stuff that Tolkien wrote later and after the fact. What Christopher is telling us here is that at least in its first versions, he did much more development later on after the fact. But in its earliest versions, the appendices material was an organic part of the story and very much in manner and air and tone like the narrative itself. So that's a really interesting thing to note and to keep in mind. Let's see. What was the other thing I wanted to emphasize about this? About the Akalabeth. It's interesting that he's including the Akalabeth, which is not exactly one of the appendices, because it didn't get included in the Lord of the Rings, obviously. But remember, you might be thinking, well, but wait, the Akalabeth is in the Silmarillion. Well, the Akalabeth is in the Silmarillion because Christopher published it there, right? There is no intrinsic connection between the Akalabeth and the Quenta Silmarillion. I'm not saying it was a bad idea for Christopher to publish them together in one volume, and to call it the Silmarillion. But again, in Tolkien's own writings, the Akalabeth is part of a different thread. Remember that Sauron defeated material that I was telling you about? Lots of Numenor stuff in there. Numenor kind of exploded into his imagination during the latter half of the Lord of the Rings, which is why he set the Lord of the Rings aside for a while and wrote a whole bunch of Numenorian stuff. Anyway, so the Akalabeth was just like a story that Tolkien wrote. He wrote the Ocean Club Papers. He wrote the Drowning of Anadune. He wrote the Akalabeth, right? He wrote all of these in around that same time. So it's in a sense a kind of like historical literary accident that the Akalabeth was not published in the appendices of the Lord of the Rings, but was published eventually in the Silmarillion. It's not intrinsically tied or distanced from either one of those things. So it makes sense for Christopher to kind of lump it in together with these. To me, anyway, it makes sense there. Astro, that's really cool. I still remember flipping back and forth from the Tengwar or Elvish passages to the appendices, feeling like I was exploring the pyramids or something. See, Astro, that makes you exactly the reader that Tolkien was trying to appeal to. Like, you were reading Tolkien exactly right. Like, Tolkien would have been beaming all over his face to know that you were doing that, which is so manifestly what he hoped and wanted readers to be doing. What he would have said to a negligent and lazy slob like myself, who just like read the narrative and then went back and read the narrative again without even noticing that there were Tengwar tables in the back. I shudder to imagine. But anyhow, okay, so hang on a second, I'm just checking one quick thing. Okay. Anyhow, so let's move on. These late writings are notable for many wholly new elements that entered the legendarium, and also for the number of departures from earlier work on the matter of the Elder Days. He's talking about the post-Lord of the Rings Silmarillion stuff that we've been looking at in Morgoth's Ring and the War of the Jewels. These late writings are notable for the many wholly new elements. Oh, sorry, no. Here he's talking about the later stuff, like the other stuff that he's including in this volume. Not just the appendices material, but then also the late writings stuff. These late writings are notable for the many wholly new elements that entered the legendarium, and also for the number of departures from earlier work on the matter of the elder days. It may be suggested that whereas my father set great store by consistency at all points with the Lord of the Rings and the appendices, so little concerning the first age had appeared in print that he was under far less constraint. So, just pause for a second. So what he's pointing out is, careful readers will observe, right, that many of the stuff, a lot of the stuff that he says about the first age in these late writings that we're going to get in the Peoples of Middle-earth is going to contradict the stuff that came before. Some of it wildly contradict the stuff that came before. And he's acknowledging the fact that this seems weird, right? Christopher is like, surely my father, the writer, as I have shown him to you now, to this point through the first 11 volumes of the history of Middle-earth, surely you will have noticed that, a desire for consistency is one of the things that my father really enjoyed. So it may surprise you to find. This is a little like warning, right? A little trigger warning. Warning, you're going to find inconsistencies. And he's going to now explain why should that be. His first explanation that I already read is that since the first age stuff hadn't been published, he was under far less constraint, right? If he wanted to change things, he still could, because there was no record that he had to maintain, no published record that he had to maintain consistency with. But then Christopher goes on, I am inclined to think, however, that the primary explanation of these differences lies rather in his writing largely from memory. The histories of the First Age would always remain in a somewhat fluid state so long as they were not fixed in published work, and he certainly did not have all the relevant manuscripts clearly arranged and set out before him. But it remains in any case an open question, whether, to give a single example, in the Essay of Dwarves and Men, he had definitively rejected the greatly elaborated account of the houses of the Edain that had entered the Quenta Silmarillion in about 1958, or whether it had passed from his mind. Okay. Yes, Madmen, exactly as you're saying, Madmen on YouTube there. None of his other writings were meant for publication. It's all working notes. Now, that's not 100% true. Some of the things that we have and that Christopher has talked about in the history of Middle-earth include materials that Tolkien did prepare for publication and indeed submitted for publication. Remember, I talked about the 1937 push, right? When he thought a ship had come in and the time for publishing the Silmarillion was now, he was absolutely preparing that material for publication and was quite hoping that it would be received and published as such. But it wasn't. Right. So he did prepare that for publication and didn't get published, and that wasn't his fault. He tried as hard as he could. But anyway, but the point is he didn't have it. And again, literally, as Jackie points out, he didn't have access to it. When Christopher finally gets all this stuff together, the work that Christopher did in putting together the history of Middle-earth, in assembling all of his father's writings, which were being kept not in spiritual drawers, but in very literal and physical file boxes. Box after box after box of random miscellaneous papers, jumbled together in many cases, undated in most cases, and through which Christopher had to sort laboriously, try to figure out how, when possible, to date them, and figure out what belongs with what period and what he's putting together. It's amazing. It is, yes, as he calls it, a fearsome jigsaw puzzle. And you may remember at various points in Christopher's editorial notes throughout the history of Middle-earth, as we've been discussing it together, you may remember many times when Christopher Tolkien even says, since I published that earlier volume, I found a new text, which certainly belongs to that period. So let me correct that. Right. Let me show you what this is. And it clearly belongs back to 1933, but I didn't know. I still hadn't found it yet when I was writing, volume 4 or whatever. So what all of this means, yes, it is an amazing undertaking that Christopher did, this incredible labor of love that he spent 25 years on, right, after his father's death. But the most important thing to remember, and this is so easy to forget, it's easy to picture the Silmarillion, the published Silmarillion. To picture in your head the published Silmarillion, and then imagine yourself backwards and say, like, okay, before 1977, that just wasn't published. So you might, even if you know better, you might somewhere in the back of your head have in your imagination a stack of orderly manuscripts, right? That is the unpublished Silmarillion, which will emerge later on, right? And of course, it's perfectly untrue. There is never any such thing. Even the work that Christopher did between 1973, when Tolkien died, and 1977, when the Silmarillion was published, was a massive amount of work to go through and sort through and find, what he felt confident were the best texts and to put together this whole thing. Anyway, Tolkien was... Tolkien didn't have the benefit of any of this stuff when he himself was working on his later writings. There are places where Christopher, has referred to notes that Tolkien, like where Tolkien did find an earlier version of like the Annals, say. And when he writes the next version of the Annals in, like 1955 or whatever, he clearly has the old Annals with him, right? And so sometimes there will be things like that, but sometimes not. And so when Tolkien is sitting down in 1970, right? Now as a 78-year-old man, and writing down all of these new ideas for stuff from the First Age. He has no way, even if he wanted to, in many cases, of looking these things up, because he has forgotten what box that old copy of, the Book of Lost Tales was in, or that old typescript of the alliterative Children of Hurin, or whatever it is, right? Not only did he not have it nice and neatly published on his bookshelf, like we all can have, thanks to Christopher, he couldn't even find it. And as I say, the stuff was such a mess that it was still years later that Christopher and the Marquette people were still finding new stuff, right? That had been crammed into the boxes. So that is such an important thing to remember, that Tolkien did not have reliable access to any of his earlier ideas in some cases. Now, I won't say any, because he clearly could put his hands on some of the things. But many of the times when he's writing things or revising things, he didn't have them. And one could even perhaps look more charitably when reflecting on this, look more charitably on Tolkien's rather frustrating habit of, whenever he picked up something again, instead of picking up where he left off, just starting it all over again. It's a little bit more understandable when you kind of realize the state of things there, right? So anyway, okay. The histories of the First Age would always remain in a somewhat fluid state, and he certainly could not have all the relevant manuscripts clearly arranged and set out before him. He certainly did not have, says Christopher. And Christopher knows, right? Trust me, he says. They were not clearly arranged and set out before him. He knows, as the one who had to identify the relevant manuscripts and clearly arrange them later on, right? So, it's a wonder that Tolkien's thoughts were as consistent as they in fact were, is what he's pointing out. So that is a really interesting piece of context to recall here for this. And I think this is my almost last we'll finish talking about Christopher's foreword, and we'll talk about the prologue next time. I wasn't sure I'd get to the prologue, but anyway, we're gonna finish the foreword. Here, Christopher is reflecting on the 12-volume history of Middle-earth. It began indeed as an entirely private study, without thought or purpose of publication, an exhaustive investigation and analysis of all the materials concerned with what came to be called the Elder Days, from the earliest beginnings, omitting no detail of name, form, or textual variation. So, the history of Middle-earth begins with Christopher Tolkien just saying, I want to sort through all of my father's papers. Now, in part, he'd been doing this with the Silmarillion editing process already, but I think it's clear that he's referring here to the after the Silmarillion was published. After 1977, he continued to pursue this project. He was like, okay, I want to find everything, omitting no detail of name, form, or textual variation. It was just what he wanted to dedicate his own work to putting together the definitive understanding of the development of Tolkien's ideas about Middle-earth, about the Elder Days. From that original work derives the respect for the precise wording of the texts and the insistence that no stone, especially stones bearing names, be left unturned. That characterizes, perhaps excessively, the history of Middle-earth, right? This insistence that no stone be left unturned is perhaps excessively characterizes the history of Middle-earth. He's like, this is how the history of Middle-earth came to be. Unfinished Tales, on the other hand, was conceived entirely independently and in an essentially different mode, at a time when I had no notion of the publication of a massive and continuous history. So remember, as many of you will have known already, remember, backing up again to Christopher's chronology here, right? So Tolkien dies in 1973. In 1973, Christopher begins the editing process. Christopher's, as soon as his father dies, Christopher has the conviction that he wants to see the Silmarillion published. He knows it was his father's dearest wish that the Silmarillion would be published, and so he sets out to make that a reality. And it takes him 4 long years, and he does it. Then, after that, somebody look up the dates. I'm forgetting the dates. Somebody look up for me the dates of Unfinished Tales and the date of Book of Lost Tales, Volume 1. Unfinished Tales was like 1980, I want to say. It was a couple years after the Silmarillion. 80 and 81, respectively. Okay, there we go. Thanks, Kel Ross. In 1980, it is so wonderful to have a group of such excellent fact checkers along with me here. There was... Okay, so in 1980, he publishes Unfinished Tales. And as he says, Unfinished Tales was conceived entirely independently. So he'd been doing all of this stuff with the Silmarillion, right? But it wasn't his editing of this. It wasn't his sorting out of the first age papers that led to Unfinished Tales. Unfinished Tales, as he explains in the prologue of Unfinished Tales, and by the way, we discussed Unfinished Tales in the history of Middle-earth, in the Mythgard Academy right before we did we did the Book of Lost Tales. So we in fact did those in chronological order. I think it was maybe late 2013 or 2014. No, I think it was late 2013 when I started Unfinished Tales. Anyway, January 2014. I did Unfinished Tales in January 2014 and was finished by May. Wow, that's irresponsible. Yeah, no, it was Mythgard Academy at that point. Mythgard Academy was started in late 2013, way back in the mists of time. With Ender's Game in between, that is amazing. Boy, I was fast back in those days. That was when I had more time. Anyway, it's because my time is so cramped these days, and I am doing so very many things at once, that these classes run longer. Anyway, never mind, bygones. But point is, in his prologue to Unfinished Tales, Christopher explains that Unfinished Tales was published in order to give people some of the additional stuff. Because Tolkien, there were a bunch of things that Tolkien completed. There were a bunch of things that Tolkien continued to write and develop. The things that you can read in Unfinished Tales, like the Disaster of the Gladden Fields and the Hunt for Gollum stuff, and the the Battle of the Fords of Isen material, right? And of course, as you know, he included in some of the Númenórean material that Tolkien had been writing in there, and he included the bonus material of the Turin story and the horribly not unfinished Tuor story. Anyway, so all that stuff gets included in Unfinished Tales. None of that has anything to do with this massive archiving project that he was doing on the Elder Days material. That was just, Lord of the Rings fans will love to know that there's more stuff that Tolkien wrote about these things. So I'm going to throw that out there, right, in Unfinished Tales. However, the history of Middle-earth. Meanwhile, while Christopher throws together, as if he did it casually or flippantly, as he assembles the Unfinished Tales material, he's finished editing the Silmarillion. It was published in 1977, right? But he's continuing his exhaustive investigation and analysis of all the materials concerned with what came to be called the Elder Days. And I believe that this was done in response to his publication, his editing of the original Silmarillion, the published Silmarillion. And I believe that was in two ways. In the foreword to the Book of Lost Tales, Volume 1, Christopher explains that to some extent, this was the publication, the beginning of the history of Middle-earth was a response to critics of the Silmarillion, who thought that Christopher, had written most of the Silmarillion materials, that he had, and they were like, it's a shame we can't tell how much was written by the father and how much by the son. And Christopher was like, oh, I can show you exactly. Right. And so, in one sense, began the history of Middle-earth publication process in a fit of pique in order to make perfectly clear how it was almost all his father's writing. So that's one sense in which the publication of the Silmarillion led directly to the history of Middle-earth. But I think there's a second sense that he's pointing to here in this paragraph, and that is his own experience with editing the Silmarillion materials. He knew that there was more out there. He knew that there was more that he could and maybe should include. He was racked with some doubts, I think, about some of the editorial choices that he'd made in the Silmarillion. He confesses to some of this. Remember, we looked at some of these passages when we were looking at the Morgoth's Ring, and especially the War of the Jewels, where he talks explicitly about this. He can see, like, after, so I think that's one of the reasons why he wanted to do this exhaustive investigation. He had not done the exhaustive investigation pre-publication of the Silmarillion. There wasn't time to do it, right? He still needed a couple decades to finish sorting through and working through all of his father's stuff. Anyway, that's, sorry, my apologies. I'm distracted by something here. So I think already when he published the Silmarillion, he knew that there was more. He knew that Not that he was ashamed of what he had put out in the published Silmarillion, but he knew that there was more. And he was driven by the desire to finish the job, essentially. And so that's what he was doing, even though he goes on to say, that it was conceived, the Unfinished Tales was conceived entirely independently and in an essentially different mode at a time when I had no notion of the publication of a massive and continuous history. So 1980, when he published Unfinished Tales, he had no plan. He had published, so Silmarillion published in 77, Unfinished Tales in 80. And in that time, he's still working on stuff, but he wasn't planning to publish the history of Middle-earth yet. And this constitutes an evident weakness in my presentation of the whole corpus, he says, which could not be remedied. When Rainer Unwin, to whom I am greatly indebted, undertook the certain venture of publishing my work on the history of the Silmarillion, in form necessarily much altered, I had no intention of entering into the history of the later ages, the inclusion of the Lost Road, the drowning of Anadune, the Notion Club papers, and above all, the history of the writing of the Lord of the Rings, extending the work far beyond my original design, was entirely unforeseen. Okay, so he's saying he was still doing, he was pursuing post-publication of the Silmarillion. Christopher continues his private quest. His personal project, to bring all of his father's papers together and in order and come to as definitive as possible an understanding not only of Tolkien's ideas about the Elder Days, but of how the ideas about the Elder Days grew. That was his project. And after Unfinished Tales was published, so Christopher had no idea of this. He's doing that on the side while he's putting together Unfinished Tales. And then Rainer Unwin comes to him and says, hey, let's publish this. And Christopher says, okay, fine, we'll publish it. Now, what is it? What is he publishing? He is publishing the history of the Elder Days. Remember, that's what he was focused on. That's why the Book of Lost Tales is written like it is, right? It's focused on. It's why he wrote. That's why he started with the Book of Lost Tales, right? Let's start at the beginning of the history of the Elder Days. And you think about it. Volume 1, History of the Book of Lost Tales, Part 1. Volume 2, History of the Book of Lost Tales, Part 2, right? Volume 3, The Lays of Beleriand. Volume 4, The Shaping of Middle-earth, right? All of these things he's going through. This is it. This is the history of the Elder Days. But by now, it's growing already into something new. And whether it was his own idea, Christopher's own idea, whether it was Rainer Unwin's idea, I don't know. But what started off as what sounded like a sufficiently ambitious project, to do an exhaustive investigation and analysis of all the materials concerned with what came to be called the Elder Days, from the earliest beginnings, omitting no detail of name, form, or textual variation, that's a huge project, right? But before he knew it, what Christopher Tolkien had been swept away into doing was writing an exhaustive investigation and analysis of his father's entire literary output in connection to Middle-earth, right? Everything Tolkien ever wrote about Middle-earth at all, including things like the Lost Road. So Volume 5 includes the Lost Road. By the time Volume 5 comes out, you can see he's shifted, right? He's going to include everything. And then we get the history of the Lord of the Rings. 4 volumes on how the Lord of the Rings came about. And then the later stuff, right? And, so Bricktails, you're completely right. It's a dangerous business, Christopher, starting a writing project. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to. Absolutely. Tristan, yes, except for The Hobbit. Yes, absolutely. And The Hobbit was accepted because he gave John Ratliff permission. Christopher gave John Ratliff permission to write the history of The Hobbit as a separate volume. And because John was already ready to work on that. Doug Anderson had already produced the annotated Hobbit. That came first, with Christopher's blessing. And then John Ratliff wrote the history of the Hobbit, again, with Christopher's blessing and support. And so therefore, Christopher left the Hobbit out of the history of Middle-earth because it was already being covered. Great. Yeah, the annotated Hobbit was in 88 for reference. So 1983 was the date of the publication of the Book of Lost Tales, Volume 1. So the history was being published by 1983. Let's see. What's the date on the Shaping of Middle-earth, Volume 4? Somebody could look that up for me. That would be good. Yeah. Anyway, so it is fascinating to see the way in which this kind of took off. 86. Okay, great. 86 for shaping. So he was getting in 1986, and then in, I bet you by the time the Shaping of Middle-earth was published, I mentioned the Shaping of Middle-earth because by the time he's getting up to the Shaping of Middle-earth, he's getting up to the time when the Hobbit was being written, chronologically in Tolkien's own development. So 86 for shaping and 87 for Lost Road. Cal Elros, thanks for that. He okay, so wait, so hang on. So what I was saying was Anderson was already working with Christopher. Like the annotated Hobbit came out in 88. I don't remember how long Doug Anderson's process was on that, but Doug has to have been, working with Christopher on compiling the materials for the annotated Hobbit at least a couple of years before 88, like by 86, when Christopher was publishing Shaping. So my suspicion is that one of the things that informed the leaving of the Hobbit out was that he already knew that work was being done on the Hobbit. And so he was kind of leaving that in Doug's hands, and then after that in John's hands, John Ratliff. So all of that stuff gets included. And so it is the annotated Hobbit and the history of the Hobbit are kind of history of Middle-earth 5.5, as you say, Cal Elros, exactly so. Okay, last note, then we're done. It's already late. But I figured I'd end with this. Since the ceaseless making of his world extended from my father's youth into his old age, the history of Middle-earth is in some sense also a record of his life, a form of biography, if of a very unusual kind. He had traveled a long road. He bequeathed to me a massive legacy of writings that made possible the tracing of that road in, as I hope, its true sequence, and the unearthing of the deep foundations that led ultimately to the true end of his great history when the white ship departed from the Grey Havens. In the twilight of autumn, it sailed out of Mythland, until the seas of the bent world fell away beneath it, and the winds of the round sky troubled it no more, and borne upon the high airs above the mists of the world, it passed into the ancient west, and an end was come for the Eldar of story and of song. I love that. Yeah, he had traveled a long road, Jackie, is certainly true. And of course, so had Christopher by this time, right? And I love this ending of Christopher's foreword because this is exactly what I have loved about studying the history of Middle-earth together, as we've been doing in these sessions now for the last 11 years. I consider the history of Middle-earth, it is such a marvelous exploration of literary history. If you really want to understand Tolkien as a writer, Tolkien's creative process, if you want not just to get to know Tolkien's stories, but Tolkien the writer, the history of Middle-earth is the best way of doing that I know of. Now, keep in mind, I don't say Tolkien the person, because I'm not under any illusion that reading all of these different drafts and manuscripts make Tolkien's character and personality an open book to us, right? I mean, I'm not, I'm insufficiently like Freudian or psychic for that. However, and the letters are really interesting and really important, Jackie, too. But to me, there is something really magical about seeing the evolution of the texts, seeing the way that his mind moves and grows, how the story grows, in the midst of his telling, his own planning and what he foresees and doesn't foresee, what, the changes in his own tastes and interests over the years and decisions that he makes and unmakes and remakes again. It is so fascinating to learn, as I say, not about Tolkien the person necessarily, because that I think would be a bit of an illusion, but Tolkien the writer, to see Tolkien's process. Somebody could have sat down and tried to tell us about what Tolkien thought, what Tolkien said, how his writing developed. But I would never have made much of it. But to see it, to just be given the raw data of what he said and how that changed over time, gives us this wonderful opportunity to see the mind of a literary genius at work over decades and decades. And that is just priceless. Yes, Emily, that is excellent. It's our palantir to perceive the unimaginable hand and mind of Tolkien at their work. Yes, love that. Love that. And his decisions were really generally much better than Feanor's were anyway. Yeah. So anyhow, in some ways, Jackie, sorry, I'm thinking, Jackie, about your comment about the letters. I love the letters, and the letters are really important and really, really interesting. But in many ways, I love the history of Middle-earth. If I had to choose between the history of Middle-earth and the letters, I'd choose the history every single time, without even a hesitation. And the reason for that, in part, is because in some ways, of course, you get more of the personal. You get his tone and everything, right? His personal tone and how he's writing to different people. There are ways in which the letters show you more of him as a person than the history of Middle-earth does. But for that reason, it masks it a little bit, right? When he's talking about his process in the letters, there are filters involved there. Right. And sometimes faulty memories and things like that. When we just can see the data for ourselves, right? Can see the texts and how they developed and changed. We're getting this, this look at the raw data. And that is, I think, so to me, that's even more valuable if what we want is to come to a better understanding of Tolkien as a writer, Tolkien as a creator, and his process. And I think that's really cool. Now, needless to say, this is not me knocking the letters, right? But it's pretty awesome. Yeah, but you're right. The letters are as close to an autobiography as we'll get. Yeah, agreed. And that's interesting. All right. Well, we're over time, but I started late tonight. Sorry about that, but we are prepared. Next time, I highly doubt we're going to get past the prologue next time. So let's look at the chapter on the Concerning Hobbits prologue and look at its development and see what we learn there in the first chapter on the prologue. And then we'll see how far we get in that next time. All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining me. And I will see you guys next time. Bye now.